Hello and welcome to Carmichael Clan Radio, the official podcast of Clan Carmichael USA. Welcome back to episode 15 of Carmichael Clan Radio. I'm your host, Scott Carmichael. On today's show, I'm joined by Kathi Kamleitner of WatchMeSee.com. Kathi is a travel planner, videographer, storyteller, and an award-winning travel blogger who moved to Scotland in 2013 and launched WatchMeSee.com to help travelers to make the most of their visits to Scotland, and hopefully to fall in love with the country the same way that she has since making Scotland her home. At WatchMeSee.com, Kathi creates travel itineraries and destination guides for travelers to Scotland and specializes in creating customized itineraries to fit any traveler's needs. In this episode, Kathi and I review several travel destinations that would interest Carmichaels, such as the Carmichael Estate and the Isle of Lismore, but we don't stop there. Kathi expands on these destinations and describes other interesting places nearby that might get overlooked without having an insider to help you plan your trip. If you're planning to travel to Scotland in the near future, visit WatchMeSee.com to learn more about using Kathi's expertise to ensure that you make the most out of your travel and let her help you to create the trip of your dreams. As always, a few things before we begin. If you're hoping to attend the Carmichael Gathering in Scotland this summer, you're almost out of time. To reserve your spot, follow the link in the show notes or visit the Clan Carmichael International website at www.carmichael.co.uk. Clan Carmichael USA will have a tent this July at the Grandfather Mountain Highland Games in Linville, North Carolina. Clan Carmichael hasn't had a presence at these games over the past few years, but we are registered and will be there, so make plans to attend if you can. If you're interested in learning more about becoming a member of Clan Carmichael USA, visit the Clan Carmichael USA website at the link below or visit www.clancarmichaelusa.com. If you've not yet become a member, we hope that you'll consider joining and becoming part of one of the best clans today. And now, let's talk to Kathi Kamleitner about planning your perfect trip to Scotland. All right, so Kathi Kamleitner, welcome to Carmichael Clan Radio. I really appreciate you taking the time on your Saturday afternoon to join me. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell me a little bit about yourself. I was reading on your website, and I was really trying to pin down a good title for you. What is it that you do? But there's so many things that you do. You're a travel writer, blogger, photographer, videographer. So I was like, well, I'll just let you tell me. So, tell me about yourself and tell me how you ended up in Scotland, too. That's actually what I'm really curious to find out, because you're from Austria originally, right?
Yeah, so I was born in Vienna, and that's where I grew up, where my family lives. And I moved to Scotland about 10 years ago to do my master's degree at Glasgow University. And as you can imagine, fell in love with the country, decided to stay for a little longer than the degree. And I am still here 10 years later. It kind of never let me go. Found a new home and made a career out of it as well in the end. It's right. There's a lot of things I do. There's a lot of eggs in my basket, I guess you could say. So yes, I'm a travel writer, I'm a content creator, I'm a podcaster, I plan itineraries, and I help people get the most out of their travels to Scotland. Traveling is something I've always loved doing, and planning is something I've always loved doing as well. And I think those kinds of skills and interests have just come together to form what I do every day for my work, and I really, really love it. Sharing my passion for Scotland and telling stories about Scotland as well.
So you said you came to Scotland to do your master's. What was your master's in, by the way?
It was in film journalism. So writing, but very, very different industry and different kind of area. But yes, it was the love for writing that really brought me to Scotland, I think.
Well, I guess that works well too with film journalism is about storytelling, and you're telling these stories, and I'm sure that you have probably run into this. I'm starting to see this with this podcast, that it seems like Scotland has so many stories to be told with its, the old history in Scotland. That's what's fun for me, is to hear these stories. And I'm sure for you, that was part of the love of Scotland when you got there, was just there were so many stories to be told. You said you were hooked right when you got there. Also, that I'm sure the landscape had something to do with that too, especially as a videographer, someone that's doing video journalism. Was that part of the appeal?
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't come to Scotland and not fall in love with the landscapes. I think something would be really wrong with you if you didn't.
Yeah.
And it's right what you say. The country is so full of stories. It's the history, it's the kind of ancient tales, it's the mythology, and everything that is kind of written into the landscape. Every mountain, every moor, every forest, it tells a story. And then you've got the people, of course, as well, who embody those stories and who are just so friendly and welcoming. And I think that's, the landscapes is one thing. The beauty of Scotland, of course, that enticed me. But I think it's really the people that made me feel so welcome. And like there was an opportunity for me to, create a new home, create the life that I want to live, and do that in a place where, when I arrived here, I spoke English, but I didn't understand anybody because of the strong accents.
Yeah.
Not being a native English speaker, it was intimidating, but yeah, it's the people that made me really consider this realistically as a place I could call my home. And I'm still here, and I'm very grateful for that.
I just thought of this too. I know with some countries, that people who move there, they never really feel like part of that country. Have the locals, they make you feel like you're part of Scotland now also?
Yeah, so there's a really lovely term in Scotland called New Scot, which is basically just someone, you would call anyone that who is not originally from here, but has moved here for whatever reason, whether it was like myself for university, or whether it might be refugees who've been granted asylum here, or it might be for whatever reason. They are now New Scots. They are just as much part of the country as the people who were born here and who grew up here. So I think that's a really nice way to consider how Scotland is open to people from outside coming in and forging that path and making that home for themselves. And yes, I mean, there are cultural differences, and there will be things that, having grown up in a different country, I will never fully understand or who won't have experienced, of course, myself. So I don't have the same cultural context. But I've always been made to feel very welcome and a part of this place. And I think particularly, with what I do, promoting the country as a tourism destination and helping other small businesses reach bigger audiences as well, and sharing what they do with the rest of the world. It's just such a nice kind of give and take relationship as well. I'm trying to be as actively a contributor to this industry as I can, even though it's not my home country. And yeah, I'm really enjoying that.
Yeah, that sounds similar to the experience that I've had. Of course, my experience is much more limited than yours, but everybody I've reached out to come on the podcast has said yes immediately. I had one of our members, he said, "I don't know how you convince all these people to get on your podcast." I'm like, I just ask. No one's ever told me no. Everyone seems so nice and willing to talk, and so I'm not at all surprised that you're welcomed as a new Scot into Scotland. And that's a neat term also, that a new Scot. I like, because it's a real inclusive. It's not in America, you're a Scottish American or something like that. There's always those two labels, but a new Scot, you're one of them.
Yeah.
So that's a neat term. So I was looking on your website, and there were two questions that you had mentioned that travelers should ask themselves before traveling. And so I wanted to ask them to you because I thought they were kind of interesting. And you may have sort of already answered the first one. What first piqued your interest in a trip to Scotland? So when you first went to Scotland, having never been there, what piqued your interest? What made you want to travel to Scotland?
So I had been fascinated with Scotland since I was about 16 or 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was in high school, I basically begged my parents that I could take a year off to travel after high school before starting college. They did agree eventually, but they didn't agree to my initial plan. My initial plan was to go to Scotland and hike and work at farms and just walk across these rolling green hills. That's the image I had in mind, where there's not many villages and just nature. They weren't quite keen on me just walking around the country on my own, so I did go somewhere else with a program, understandably. But after that, Scotland kind of fell off my radar for a little bit. So I had never travelled here on holidays or anything like that. And it was when I decided to apply for universities abroad that I kind of picked back up this idea of Scotland and remembered this fascination I had as a teenager, thinking of green landscapes and the coast and the mountains and the fields and the sheep and all these things. And I think it's that maybe a bit too idyllic idea of Scotland that is, true in some parts and very, very different in other parts. It's
Sure.
such a varied country. But I think it's this idea of the idyllic highlands and the lowlands and the coastlines that brought me here.
Well, I think that's probably on par with most people who visit Scotland for the first time. I know that I first got interested as a young kid, just knowing that Carmichaels were from Scotland. I never really thought much about it in college. That same idea of what Scotland was, it really drew me to become more interested in the country and learn more about Carmichaels. So it sounds like you went through what most people go through, because I think most people who visit Scotland, I'm sure Scotland loves that's the image that people have. They're like, we've got to visit Scotland. So that's interesting, though, that's what got you interested in Scotland first also, or the landscapes, the sheep. So the next question that I want to ask you too is, and it's from your side also, is what is most important to you when you travel? And I thought this was a really interesting question that people can learn a lot from, I'm sure.
I love it so much that you're turning the table on me here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what is really important to me when I travel, regardless of where it is, it's to feel like I'm connected to the places I visit. And it's not just a box-ticking exercise, or not just taking 100 pictures of 100 different places and then not even remembering what they were when I look at them afterwards.
Right.
I want to be able to come home with stories to tell and with experiences where I met locals, or someone helped me out because I missed a bus, or, those sorts of moments. Maybe it's a wildlife encounter, maybe it's a specific activity I've never tried before. So I think it's about making those new experiences in a way that make me feel connected with the destination and with the place and with the people. And it's not just watching a film, so to say, right, happen in front of you or outside the bus window or the car window racing through. So it's really very much to me about the connectedness with the places I visit.
I guess a lot of people who travel to Scotland probably target the larger cities. I think that's probably natural for traveling to any country. People who come to the United States, they want to see New York or, one of the big cities. Same with Scotland. People go to Edinburgh, Glasgow. Do you think that you get more of a sense of connection in a larger city, or do you think you get that sense of connection more when you travel kind of off the beaten path to these less explored areas? Is there a difference, in terms of like which one where you really feel that connection, or is it sometimes just what you make of it?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think on the one hand, when you go to a place that is very popular and there's a lot of tourists coming through, they can feel a little bit transient, like no one's there for a really long time. There's a constant influx of people and kind of coming and going. So even for locals, I think, at least that's what I know from friends who live in Edinburgh, which is much more touristy than Glasgow, it can feel a little bit hard to really make connections with people because they're coming and going in such large numbers and so quickly.
Yeah.
So it can be maybe a little bit trickier to feel that level of connectedness in those places. But I think it can still be done. And I think the key is the speed at which you're traveling and how actively you're trying to immerse yourself in local experiences and really getting to know the people and the land and the history of the place. Because you can do all that in Edinburgh and just spend 2 weeks in Edinburgh, right?
Mm-hmm.
and then you get that level of connection. I really think that. So I think it's about how fast do you travel, how much time do you give yourself to feel like you're making a genuine effort to connect, because, you know, it's connection needs to go both ways, and you can't just expect someone to make you feel like you're their new best pal, basically. But I think if you slow down and if you show a genuine interest, then that's possible anywhere, whether you go off the beaten path or you go to the more popular places. But I do always want to encourage people as well, of course, to look a little bit beyond the kind of the superstars, so to say, the highlights that most people will have heard of. And, you know, most people who come to me with the same 4 or 5 destinations, that's what they want to see. But it's usually just because that's what they've heard about. As soon as you start telling them about some of the hidden gems and the regions that are further off the beaten path, people are genuinely quite happy to explore and see something a little different. And, you know, when you then go to those smaller places, people are really excited that you're there, that you're showing an interest in their small village or their little patch of coastline or whatever it is. So yeah, I think it's a great way to make that feeling of connection easier, when you kind of look beyond the things that everybody else has talked about before.
And that makes sense. Just the sheer number of travelers and tourists that would come through a big city, that, you know, residents of that city, obviously, you know, they kind of stop noticing all this tourist traffic coming through, and they see it every day, I guess. But in the countryside or in a less traveled area, you know, it's more unusual to have a tourist come through, so they're obviously going to pay more attention to it. So that makes sense. And that kind of gets to the topic that I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about too, are some Carmichael specific destinations that all Carmichaels will know about. And this is where having a expert will come in handy, because I think you're right that most people may come to you with these 4 or 5 places because they just don't know of anywhere else. And that may be true with Carmichaels too. We know about the estate in Lanarkshire, and then maybe Lismore. And that's, you know, for me, those are the 2 top places that I would think to go visit. But so, you know, this is where you are a very valuable asset to a traveler, where you can tell them, you know, where else to look, even in around those places. So if you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about some Carmichael specific places to visit, and then maybe some places around those that people might miss if they didn't have someone kind of aiming their direction at some other places.
Absolutely.
So you have put together some research for us for Carmichaels, and I felt like I was coming to the show unprepared, because I'm usually the one who's done all the research. So first of all, thanks so much for doing that. But tell us some places that you've picked out as a travel expert for Carmichaels to visit.
Absolutely. So yes, you've mentioned the estate in Lanarkshire, and I think it's such a nice place to start, because Lanarkshire is not necessarily on many people's radars. Even within Scotland, people don't necessarily think of Lanarkshire as a place to visit. There are some sites there that people know about, like New Lanark, but that's really as far as it goes. So I think it's really nice to start in that area and see what there is not too far from there. So I'm not an expert on Carmichael clan history, of course. I did read a little bit about it and read about some of the standout members of the clan throughout history and the places that they are connected to. But yes, I would definitely start with South Lanarkshire. You're obviously really close to Glasgow and Edinburgh, so it's really easy to get to, and a great place to start your trip when you come to Scotland, because, you know, wherever you fly into, it's going to be easy to travel down there first and spend a few days exploring. New Lanark is a brilliant site to visit if you're already in the area. I don't know if you know very much about it, but it's a former cotton mill that the owner of that cotton mill had this idealistic idea of creating almost like a utopian village for his employees and for all of the workers. So it's a village surrounding the mill buildings, and it's right by a river as well, and there's a nature reserve. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's absolutely beautiful to visit. There's an exhibition about the mill itself and the process of turning the raw cotton into fabrics and cloth that was then used and exported. But you can also still see all the houses that he built for his employees. Some of them have exhibitions inside, so you can actually look inside. And some of them are still residential buildings, so there's people still living there. So it's pretty cool to just wander around this, almost like a model village of what the ideal village would have looked like. There's a school for all the children, there's a small village shop, there's a cafe. It's a really beautiful site to visit, and I think it's probably the best known site in Lanarkshire, but definitely worth spending a day there, or even just half a day, and then going for a walk in the nature reserve. There's some nice waterfalls and things like that. So New Lanark is definitely the highlight, I would say, in that area to visit. And then if you move kind of in the other direction, so a little bit further east, for example, Crawford Castle, so the ruins of Crawford Castle near Biggar, that's actually not very far from areas like Peebles. And I read a little bit about the Carmichaels also being involved with the Borders Reivers.
Right.
So the Reivers were these anarchic kind of raiders who stole livestock and smuggled whiskey and did all these terrible things back in the day in the Scottish borders. And there was a Carmichael who was out to get them, whose job was to find them. So the Borders as a region is full of history, and I think if we were to look into that a bit further, we would probably find the name Carmichael all throughout the most important parts of that region's history. So I think just exploring that area, whether or not it's a specific Carmichael site, I think you'll get a sense for what they were in for and what they experienced there. Peebles is a wonderful place. It's a small town right on the River Tweed. It has actually been named as one of the best high streets in the UK because the main street has so many cool independent shops and coffee shops and restaurants. So it's really nice to go for a browse and a stroll. It's not something you find very often anymore. I can imagine it might be similar in the States where everything kind of moves to shopping centres and malls, but the high streets very often become a little bit unloved. So Peebles is great for that bit of shopping and some good food as well. And then that entire area is part of the Southern Uplands, so a low-lying mountain range, much lower than the Highlands up north, but still absolutely beautiful, full of glens and waterfalls and lochs in the hills. And just going for a drive through those glens, you'll see sheep farmers with their herds of sheep on the road, and it's really very idyllic. It almost sounds surreal, but it really is like that.
Yeah, I was going to say that sounds like the image that you came to Scotland first with.
Absolutely. There's a road through one of the glens near Moffat, which again is not very far from New Lanarkshire and from Biggar. When I drove through that, I thought I'm in a fairy tale, because it was lush and green. The heather was already blooming. I think it was August when I was there for the first time. There were sheep everywhere, and it was just stunning. You had the low stone walls left and right of the road covered in moss. It was just beautiful. And it's an area that I think many people don't even know exists. Everybody's so focused on heading up north into the Highlands, into the big mountains, which is fair enough. It's stunning. And we'll talk a bit about the Highlands and Lismore in a bit. But yes, I think it's worth just spending a few days in the south or your entire trip in the south and exploring those glens of the Borders to reconnect with what it would have meant to be, in charge of those roads and how hard it would have been to patrol those lands, and be the person who's on the hunt for the raiders. It would have been really, really difficult, and you can see why when you're actually in those landscapes.
And I think that's a good suggestion too, to have all these sites that are close by, Biggar and New Lanark, because a lot of the Carmichaels that will visit Scotland will rent one of the cottages that are available at the estate. And they're kind of based out of there. They may not get into the Highlands on their trip. They're kind of in that area. And so these are great suggestions because they're all close by. I'm sure they're all easily accessible, not a long trip to see them. So those are great suggestions. I had read a little bit about Sir John Carmichael, and I think he's the one you're referring to, that was the warden of the border region. And I'm sure that you're right, that you could visit lots of different sites, and there's probably some kind of Carmichael story that took place there. I didn't know anything about the region, the border region. I did a show with a gentleman that has a business that does virtual tours of the border region, and I didn't know there was any Carmichael association with that until after we were finished. So that's a really neat thing too, to kind of follow around the border region and explore this, Sir John Carmichael and kind of his footsteps and his stories. What would be your next recommendation? Are there others in this area?
Yeah, so another place I think to visit, very obvious Carmichael site, is Fenton Tower in East Lothian, so out towards North Berwick. I've actually not had a chance to look up the exact history of Fenton Tower, so I don't know if you can enlighten me on that a little bit.
Well, that's a perfect thing to talk about next, because that was the castle that Sir John Carmichael built. That was his home.
Right, okay. Oh, what a wonderful home to have.
I know. I saw a map of it and saw some pictures on the inside and thought the same thing. So East Lothian, where is that located? That's near Edinburgh, right?
Yes, so East Lothian is a region that is kind of south and east of Edinburgh. The two towns that probably stand out most, or many people might have heard about, is on the one hand North Berwick and Dunbar. So those are two of the bigger coastal towns in East Lothian, but there's also a lot to see kind of more inland. One of my favourite places to visit in East Lothian is Preston Mill. That's in a village called East Linton. It's a very, very small village, and the mill is one of the oldest still standing mills in Scotland. And the reason why many people might have seen it before is if they've watched Outlander, because it was used in the first season as where they shot scenes about the mill of Lallybroch, the main home of Jamie Fraser. So they shot that at the actual mill, and it's a pretty cool looking structure. It almost looks a bit like a witch's hut, because the roof of the mill is cylindrical and then it's a little bit crooked. So it does have kind of it almost looks like a witch's hat, or, the wizarding hat in Harry Potter or something like that. And it's beautiful, and it's tiled with these Dutch tiles that were imported. And at the time, because so much export from Scotland went to the Netherlands, so they had to, when they came back, the boats were empty, so they were much more likely to run aground or flip over or anything like that. So they actually weighed down the boats with those Dutch tiles and brought them back to the UK, and then they were used in all of these different buildings. So they were mostly there for the weight, but they're actually beautiful tiles. So it's a really, really stunning mill to visit, and you can do a tour there as well. Learn about the history of milling itself, the history of the building, and all the different floods it has kind of survived. And it's nice. It's nice, obviously, to have the Outlander reference to it and see something that you've seen on the screen, but then really also learn about how important that building was for the region and the industry, so to say, of milling, and how every village would have had a mill like that, but most of them haven't survived over the centuries, and this one has. So it's pretty stunning.
What kind of travel time, if someone was at the Carmichael Estate and had rented a car or something like that, how long does it take to drive to like East Lothian to Linton, those areas? Is that a full day, or like?
It's an easy day trip to do. I imagine if I had to estimate, it would be 1.5 to 2 hours, depending maybe a bit on traffic. So it's not far at all. And then you can spend all day really in East Lothian and visit the mill, and then head on to the coast. North Berwick is beautiful, so is Dunbar. Both of them have beaches and colourful harbours, and you can do boat trips as well to some of the islands out in the Firth of Forth. So particularly when you come in the summer and all the seabirds are nesting on these small uninhabited islands, it's absolutely stunning. And it's an experience that, many people think about all the islands on the west coast again, but they don't necessarily think about the islands on the east coast. There's just not as many, but they're just as beautiful, and really a spectacle when you do see all the seabirds gathering at them, fishing, the big gannets, big birds with white feathers and then black tips on their wings. and yellowhead. So they're really striking birds, really big as well, and they're there in the thousands. So it's brilliant to see something like that somewhere where you might not have expected it, because it's on the east coast and so close to Edinburgh as well.
I wonder why the East Coast islands are often overlooked. Do they have the same history that the West Coast? I mean, obviously they're on the different coasts. It wouldn't be the exact same history, but why is that they're often missed?
I think a big reason is because they are just so much smaller. So many of those islands, they might have had a settlement on them for defensive purposes, or, a lighthouse to guide in the ships coming from Europe. But they wouldn't have been, if you compare that to the Isle of Mull or Isle of Skye, those are big islands with big populations. So I think that might be one reason why they are generally less known or less visited. There's no ferries to them, so you have to do boat trips because they are uninhabited. So I think it just makes it a little bit harder to learn about. But then when you actually go and do visit them, it's really worth the effort. And like I said, both of those are so close to Edinburgh, and of course also to South Lanarkshire by that. So yeah, it's definitely a good day trip to do from that area.
Okay. I've honestly never been told anything about the islands on the East Coast. And it may be that because it takes a little more effort to visit those, that it's more rewarding. I've heard about Iona, I think it is, that's right off the coast of Mull. That is a little bit more challenging to get to, but also because of that, it's sort of remained untouched. And so maybe those East Coast islands offer a little bit of, more quiet. I've heard about the air, on Iona that, people will talk about. It's just so clean. And so maybe, when you go through that extra effort, there is a larger reward, when you get there. So, that's another great suggestion too, to visit the East Coast islands too.
Absolutely. And just like that, you've already probably filled about a week.
That's true.
Of your time in Scotland by visiting all of those places that aren't the big names that people often talk about, but something a little bit different and still unique and really memorable experiences.
Yeah. Something I've heard also is that the only, the problem when people visit Scotland is just not having enough time. It wasn't that they didn't know where else to go. A lot of times they just didn't have the time to visit all the places.
Absolutely. I've been here for 10 years and my list just keeps getting longer rather than shorter.
Well, at least you've gotten started. I'm still here waiting to go. And so my list only grows. I'm not checking anything off just yet.
For you're probably most interested in Lismore though, right? Not necessarily the southern parts of the Carmichael area.
That is high on my list. My aunt visited last summer, Scotland, and Lismore was where she went. She's an artist, and so she wanted to go do some drawings and some paintings, and so
fantastic.
Lismore was her top destination. So it is on my list. Tell me about Lismore. What about Lismore might attract Carmichaels who aren't descendants of the Lismore Carmichaels?
So Lismore is probably within the region of the West Coast that is among my favourites. It's a small island really close to Oban, a beautiful town on the coast. It's often called the gateway to the Isles because there's a lot of ferries that leave from Oban to several of the islands that are a bit further away. There's also a ferry to Lismore, so it's really easy to get there. Oban is wonderful. There's a distillery that is really charming and in the middle of town. So if you're staying in town, you can go and have as many drams as you like because you don't have to drive.
Yeah.
Always a good thing to do. And then from Oban, you can catch a boat over to Lismore. The ferry takes maybe about an hour or so, I would say. And Lismore is lovely because you can explore it on foot or you can explore it by bike. I don't think you're allowed or able to bring a car across.
It's probably small enough too, though, that a bike would be sufficient, right?
Exactly. So I know there's bike hire places in Oban where you can hire a bike and bring it across on the ferry for free. And it is small enough, like you say, to cycle across. And you can probably see quite a lot of it walking as well. There's a Gaelic Heritage Centre on the island. So, a lot of people want to hear Gaelic when they come to Scotland, but they might not have the time to travel all the way to the Western Isles where it is most spoken still. So actually being able to hear it and learn about the language somewhere that is a little bit easier to get to and doesn't require as much time, that might be enough to entice you to go to Lismore and learn about the language and about the Gaelic heritage of that region as well. And it's just beautiful. I mean, so hearing about your aunt going there as an artist, I can just imagine the sheer joy she must have felt when she saw the islands, because the island is surrounded by other islands and peninsulas. So you've got rugged coastline wherever you look and mountains in the distance. And it just feels like such a maze of waterways and islands. It must be amazing to explore as an artist, as a visual artist, and feel inspired by the air, by the beaches, by the colours of the sea. Yeah, I can just envision it. I feel like I'm there with her.
Yeah. One of the neatest drawings she did was a pencil drawing of just two trees that had such a unique, kind of shape to the branches and so forth. And they could have been in the backyard in Tennessee or something, but they were in Lismore, and it just made it was a really neat drawing that she did. It being from Lismore and that being where our family came from, it means a lot more than just two trees, but yeah, some of the pictures she brought back from Lismore were really, really impressive, and pushed it even higher on my list of places to visit in Scotland.
Oh, absolutely. I can imagine that.
Yeah. Are there any places to stay on Lismore, or is it kind of visit by day, head back to Oban to stay?
I'm not sure. I don't think that there are places to stay on Lismore.
Okay.
Although I might be wrong, so I can definitely have a look at that. There might be some cottages you would be able to rent. I don't think that there's something like a hotel or a bed and breakfast.
Right, okay.
But there are obviously people living on the islands who run the cafe at the Heritage Centre and things like that. So, there might be places you can actually hire. You can stay in Oban, so that's really nearby, just the short ferry away. And then there's another wonderful place to visit in Port Appin. So Lismore is kind of a long north to south running island. The Oban ferry comes in at the southern tip of Lismore, but then when you go to the very north of the island, there's another small ferry that connects it back to the mainland to Port Appin, and there's several wonderful hotels in Port Appin that are especially well known for their food. Really fresh seafood. You can't really go wrong with that. They'll get it more or less straight off the boats and into the kitchen. So the Pier House Hotel in Port Appin would be a perfect home base. You basically see Lismore all day long from the hotel, and you can have your breakfast looking at Lismore and then catch the small boat across to explore the island and then come back. So that might be a really nice way to kind of connect the two ferries as well. So spending a few days in the area and almost doing a loop with Port Appin and Oban as your kind of start and end points would be a really lovely way to do it as well.
I like that. I think the Carmichaels also have there's some tie with, the Stewarts of Appin. I'm not 100% on the history, so Port Appin might be a neat place to be, just to kind of explore around also. Do you know if, so I'm in a small town in Tennessee, and camping is popular here. I wonder if it's allowed to camp on Lismore. If that's maybe more adventurous than some tourists would want to be, but I wonder if that's, I think it'd be really neat to camp out on a Western Isle, just at one with nature, listen to the sounds of nature all night. Do you know if that's permitted?
It should be. So wild camping is permitted in almost all parts of Scotland. There's very few exceptions, but you can pretty much camp anywhere as long as you treat the land with respect, right? And as long as you leave no trace, you carry out everything that you carried in, basically. So as long as you kind of stick to what we call the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, you can wild camp pretty much anywhere in Scotland, and you have the right to roam on anybody's land, even if it's private property. You can walk across and you can responsibly pitch your tent wherever you like. So yes, I think that would be a really cool way to spend the night on Lismore, is if you bring your camping equipment and spend a night under the stars.
Yeah, I never thought of that. I thought of that when you were talking about, kind of making the loop around. I thought that'd be neat to just pitch a tent on Lismore for a night and not worry about finding a place to stay. Just pick one out in a field somewhere.
Exactly.
And I'd heard of the right to roam laws in Scotland too, and so I thought that might be possible. That'd be a really neat thing to do. Maybe not for the entire trip, but it wouldn't be bad for a couple nights.
Exactly.
One at least. Are there any Carmichael places in the Highlands that we should put on our list to visit?
I think, and I couldn't tell you the exact connection, but I think there are some connections with Fort Augustus on Loch Ness as well. I'm not quite sure of the exact way it all came down, but if you're heading up to the Highlands, then I think Fort Augustus on Loch Ness, there's some connection with the Carmichaels there as well. And it's a lovely area to visit. And again, I think Loch Ness is obviously a place that a lot of people have heard about. And a lot of people will drive by and do very quick visits of the big sites there, Urquhart Castle being one of them. Maybe you jump on a boat trip across the loch to try and find Nessie, which I have heard helps if you have a few whiskies.
I bet it does.
It might be easier then.
Yeah.
But a lot of people do that and then they continue onwards rather than really exploring the other areas of Loch Ness. So Loch Ness, the south side of the loch, so kind of going from Fort Augustus up towards Foyers, which is a wonderful village about halfway up Loch Ness. So that south side, where the roads are a lot smaller and less busy, is really, really wonderful to explore. You drive up quite high above Loch Ness, get lovely views of the area, and then come back down. And in Foyers, there's a set of waterfalls, the Falls of Foyers. They inspired Robert Burns, the poet from the south of Scotland, to write poetry about the landscape and about the waterfalls and about how the water gushes down into a cauldron of rock. Basically, it's really, when you visit that place, you can really see why he felt so inspired to write about the natural landscape and the awe he found himself in. So the Falls of Foyers are a wonderful place to visit in that kind of wider area, and because it's on the quieter side of the loch, many people miss it and they don't, they drive past on the other side, on the other shore, and miss all of that beauty and that goodness. So yeah, it's worth exploring Loch Ness with a bit more time to see the places that are on the other side of the main road, so to say.
And that's on the south side, you said?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. I didn't know there was a more popular side to Loch Ness. I wonder what is it that's on the north side that attracts more people? Do you know?
So on the one hand, it's because the road is better on the north side. So that's where the main road runs. And then the biggest attraction is Urquhart Castle, which is, I think, the third most visited tourist attraction in Scotland, or castle, something like that. Lots and lots of people visit. And it's a beautiful castle ruin. It's really interesting. There's a lot of really interesting history around it as well. But it is a place that most people visit, and it will always be busy, especially in the summer months. So you can pass all that by and explore the other side.
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan to pass the busier spots, although they may have some things to see, but just to kind of head to the other side where it's less crowded. And I think the Falls of Foyers sounds neat also. I did an episode about Robert Burns, and so it would be neat to see a falls that he was inspired to write about. Any other places that we should check out, even if they're not particularly related to Carmichael? Like, what are some things that may be close by to some other sites that we need to put on our list? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, I think one place that shouldn't be missed, and that would not be very far from Loch Ness, is Culloden battlefield. And I know the Carmichaels have also fought in the Jacobite rebellion and in that battle. So it might be a very popular place. Most people kind of have heard about it before, but I think it's still, it's that for a reason. And I think it's really important to visit and to better understand. And I think it also helps bringing together the entire context, not just of Clan Carmichael, but all the clans, and why or how you found yourself, on the other side of the ocean, being a Carmichael so far away from Scotland, and many other people with ancestry in Scotland as well. Because, of course, the Battle of Culloden was one of the main events that have driven so many people out of Scotland and have kind of started this cascade of immigration for various different reasons. So I think Culloden battlefield is a really good place to visit to learn about that, not just about the battle and what led to it, but also its consequences and what it has meant and still means for Scotland today, and the Scottish diaspora, so to say, people with ancestry all over the world whose ancestors have emigrated and have left Scotland sometime in the kind of aftermath of Culloden and the Highland clearances. And, it explains why Lismore is so sparsely populated, and other islands like it are so sparsely populated, because so many people have left. That's why there's so many ruins, because people were forced out of their land or made the choice to leave. So I think that kind of can help tie it together a little bit and add that historical context to understand the landscape better. And, in the end, learn about the ancestry and your roots in a different way as well.
Yeah, that's actually a really cool suggestion. Even if a Carmichael was planning a trip to Scotland, starting in, Lanarkshire area, traveling north through Lismore and ending at Culloden, sort of with my family in particular, the Carmichaels that immigrated to the United States were kind of back and forth. The records that I've seen, they were sort of back and forth between Lanarkshire and Lismore, and ended up in Lismore in the mid 1700s, and then immigrated to the U.S. And so it looks, just looking at the dates, it's sort of consistent with someone who was involved at the Battle of Culloden and then left afterwards. Those times all sort of matched up. But as just thinking while you're talking, it would be a really cool sort of historical trip for my Carmichaels to kind of follow those footsteps north, from Lanarkshire to Lismore to Culloden, end your trip there, where so many of the ancestors who were living in Scotland, where that's kind of where their stay in Scotland ended too, and then came to a different country. So I love that suggestion with visiting Culloden battlefield at the end. Sounds like a really neat idea. And actually, that's a great segue into you telling me about what you do, because you've gone over a lot of these suggestions, and to someone listening, it may be like, well, that's a lot. How am I going to make sense of all this? And that's where you can come in. So you have a business that's called Watch Me See, and you do Scotland itinerary planning. You have some ready-made itineraries, but you also do custom itineraries. And something like what I just described would be something that you could do, where if I was hiring you to do a trip for me, I could say, hey, we want to start here and kind of work our way here. And that would be something that you do, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So tell me about Watch Me See, because I think this is a really neat thing that our listeners should know a lot about and can reach out to you.
Yeah. So I started Watch Me See, and initially it was a travel blog out of passion. I was passionate about Scotland and about traveling, and I put the two together and started writing about my own travel experiences around Scotland and sharing what I thought was some of the highlights and some great places to visit, places to stay, and so on and so forth. And that then kind of just spiraled into becoming my main job, which is fantastic. And I love doing it. And I still have the website. It's still a blog. I still shared lots and lots of free information on there, travel guides and itineraries and lots of tips. But then, yes, I do also plan itineraries, bespoke and custom for my clients. And it's amazing because I've planned anything from solo adventures and surprise trips and honeymoons and anniversary holidays, all sorts of things, families, multi-generational traveling together, lots of people looking for their ancestry and finding out where their ancestors came from and following those footsteps as well. So I'm not an ancestry researcher. I don't have that sort of skill set. I'm not, that's other people who do that, and I think do a fantastic job at that as well.
Well, no, but you have a PhD also, is that right?
Yeah.
So you know how to research, even though
Yes.
you may not be a genealogist. You're capable of jumping in and doing research.
Exactly. And I think I'm just a natural planner. I love having lots of plans and then being able to take it day by day, right? But knowing in advance what my options are. And I think so many people come to Scotland or make the decision to visit Scotland kind of on a whim, and they don't maybe know that much about it yet. And then it's all about making sure that trip is the best it can be, and they get the most out of it, and they don't rush themselves, but they also get to see a variety of places. And that's what I love helping people to figure out. The questions you asked me at the start, what's important to you when you travel? I think so many people don't think about that when they plan their trips, and I'm really trying to help people make conscious decisions about where to go, what to see, and how to get to that level of feeling connected, whether it's through experiences or through learning about their own ancestors' history, or just seeing specific places that they've heard about before. And yes, I love doing it, and it brings me so much joy to know that I'm a little part of people's, many people I work with have dreamt about visiting Scotland for a very long time. It's not just a holiday. It's a place they've consciously made the effort and the choice to visit and to travel to. So knowing that I'm a little part of making that trip even better is one of the most rewarding things about my job. And that's why I love doing it so much. And I missed it so much during the pandemic when people weren't able to travel. And now that I get to do it again and people come back and explore Scotland again, it's I know it sounds a little bit cheesy, but it does make me so happy. And it makes me very, very grateful for what I do and that I'm able to do this as my job as well.
I don't think it sounds cheesy at all. I think it's a very important role. And I think it's probably overlooked. Maybe people with the internet, people think, well, I can just plan my own thing. But hearing you talk, I feel like you're talking about me, someone who's dreamed of traveling to Scotland for years. And when I do visit Scotland, I want to make sure I, get the most out of it. If I'm going to go for 2 weeks, I could sit around one place for 2 weeks and enjoy it, I'm sure. But when I leave, think, well, I probably should have done some more. And so I think you have a very important role, and is something that, I would encourage, listeners to reach out if they're planning a trip to Scotland. I have this sort of belief that, anything worth doing is worth overdoing. And to me, it's well worth spending extra money to make sure that you do your trip right, So I think it's great. At the first you mentioned you want to feel connected to a place. And having never been there, it makes so much sense to me to reach out to someone who lives there, who does this for a living, for you can help me connect with the place. I think it's a fantastic thing you're doing. Not cheesy at all. And I can easily understand how it would be a really rewarding career to help people make the most out of their trips to Scotland.
Yeah. And it is also, I always find that it allows people to focus on the fun part. They don't have to, anything you might worry about before your trip. How much money do I need? How do I get from A to B? What is the best car rental place? All these practical questions, right, that aren't necessarily fun to research. I can answer those questions, and I very often do that for my clients. And the feedback I get is the things that have worried me before or have overwhelmed me in putting this trip together, they're now all sorted. So I can focus on the fun part, the planning the experiences, and then actually just having the experiences when I'm there, rather than worrying about all these things I didn't know. Because, planning a trip, especially overseas, that is so important to you, can be super overwhelming. And I think it's good to have someone in your corner who can help with the things that aren't as much fun as the actual trip itself. So that's kind of how I see myself, a bit of the angel in the corner that helps with the stressful stuff.
And so on your site, on watchmesee.com, and I'll put links in the show description, but you mentioned you have, travel guides, you've got travel tips, checklists, which I think is a really cool thing. You do seem to be putting a lot of information out free, just a lot of useful things for travelers. You have a podcast also, right? That's Wild for Scotland.
Yeah, right. I started that during the pandemic, and it's been so much fun to do and keep doing it as well. I tell stories on that podcast, and it's very different from maybe the resources you find on the website, which are much more kind of helpful and practical. And the podcast is about instilling dreams and inspiring you to feel connected with Scotland from afar and giving you a sense of what it's like to be here.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, if anybody wants to check that out, it's Wild for Scotland, and you can find it on all the podcasting apps, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and so on. So yeah, have a listen and feel like you're here with me.
I definitely will. Anything I can do to feel like I'm in Scotland, I'm game. I'll pour a dram while I listen.
Perfect.
If that helps with the experience. Just to review, how can anyone who wants to learn more about you, they can go to your website, which is watchmesee.com. Do you have any social media sites that you keep active, or where else can listeners go to learn more about you?
Yeah, so I have an Instagram account at WatchMeSee. I also have a Facebook page at WatchMeSee as well. And I have a Facebook group called Wild for Scotland, Trip Planning Made Easy. So you can join that. It's free to join. And I do regular live sessions there as well, answering questions. If you have any questions about coming to Scotland, you can put them in there and I'll try to help out in any way I can and share photos. And other people, after they've travelled here themselves, will share their own tips and their own photos. It's really a nice place to come and meet other people who love Scotland just as much. So those are the two social media I use mostly. And you can also always email me, Kathi@watchmesee.com. You'll find that on my website as well. If you have any questions about your trip to Scotland or you're interested in getting me to help you plan your itinerary.
Okay. One last question I forgot to ask. Is there a best time of the year to visit Scotland? An ideal time? I just thought of that. Is that...
You're opening a can of worms.
Oh, am I? Okay.
I think obviously any season or every month of the year has something different to offer, and there's pros and cons to come in the summertime. It might be busier, it might be more expensive to get accommodation and things like that. But then you have much longer days, you have more daylight. It usually is more warmer in the summertime as well. Maybe not hot, but warmer. But in the winter, it's wonderful. If you're lucky and it snows and you have the snow on the mountains and in the glens, it's absolutely gorgeous. And it's quieter. There's often a lot of interesting wildlife in the winter around as well. So there's really no wrong choice, let's put it that way. And I think it comes back down to what you want to experience. Again, if you want a specific wildlife experience, you might need to choose the month when they are most active and when they're around. If you want to see gardens in full bloom, you'll have to come in June or in July and not in October or November. So things like that can really impact that. With all of that said, my personal favourite times to visit is kind of in May and June, because I love just the landscapes coming to life. The flowers blooming, you've got lambing season, so lots of baby lambs out in the fields, lots of kind of seabirds arriving and starting to form their big breeding colonies, and it's just having those long days with lots of daylight is really, really lovely too. But then I also love coming in or travelling around in September when the heather is in bloom and all the hills are purple because of the heather flowers. So there really are so many highlights throughout the seasons. I don't think there's a wrong choice.
Okay. It's really evident listening to you, you tell me about your Facebook group where you field questions and all the information you put on your website, and especially listening to you talk, that while making travel itineraries is your main job now, it's also clearly your passion. And someone wouldn't do that so much stuff without charging unless it was their passion. So it really comes through that you love what you do. And I really appreciate you taking the time to tell other Carmichaels and anyone else listening to Carmichael Clan Radio about what it is you do, and to suggest and kind of go over some places in Scotland that we should visit. So thanks so much for your time, and I really appreciate it. And I hope that some listeners will get in touch with you and help and let you help them make the most out of their trip to Scotland.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I hope to meet you in Scotland one day as well.
Yeah, you will. You definitely will. I don't know when, but I did hear you mention that you do travel itineraries for surprises, and my birthday is coming up. So if my wife is listening,
Get in touch.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, I appreciate it, Kathi.
Thank you so much.
Once again, thanks so much to Kathi Kamleitner for joining me on today's show. If you're making the investment to travel, ensure that you make the most of your trip by contacting her at watchmesee.com and let her help you to create the trip of your dreams. Carmichael Clan Radio is growing, but I would love to keep reaching new listeners. To support the show, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and share it with anyone else that you think might enjoy it. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or subscribe to the Clan Carmichael USA Substack page at clancarmichael.substack.com. By subscribing to the Substack page, each time I release a new episode or essay, it'll land right in your inbox. So be sure to get signed up to receive all the latest from Clan Carmichael. And finally, if you like what we're doing, please leave a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or leave some feedback in the comments section on Substack. Your reviews help to promote the show and make it easier for others to find us, and it also lets me know that you are enjoying the show. So until next time, toujours prêt. See you soon.